Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Bibbidi Bobbidi Books. My name is Ellie and today I'm going to be filming my April reading wrap up. So I didn't read a huge ton of books in April, but I have read quite a few chunky adult fantasies, so I think that's probably why, because those ones always take me a little bit longer to get through. But yeah, I had an interesting mix of books, so without further ado, I'm just going to jump straight in with the first book. So the first one that I read was Kings of the Wild, written by Nicholas Eames. This is a much beloved fantasy story and it's quite a comedic adult fantasy that doesn't take itself too seriously, and it's been inspired by the tabletop role-playing game of Dungeons and Dragons, which I personally really enjoyed because I play Dungeons and Dragons, so I really loved all the little nods to that game and the little nerdy references that were thrown in there. But essentially this is a story about a group of middle-aged men, they're ex-mercenaries and they're coming back together for one last hurrah. And as I said, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, it's quite silly in its comedy and its humour style in here. And there's also quite a lot of references to 70s rock music. So if that's your jam, then I think you're probably going to really get on with this one and you're going to notice all those little hidden Easter eggs and really appreciate the story for that. I do think quite a lot of those references went over my head a little bit, but yeah, I really enjoyed that. It's quite a refreshing take. I like the fact that we're following a group of middle-aged men because fantasy tends to follow younger protagonists, so it was quite an interesting new perspective. But unfortunately I didn't love this one as much as I wanted to. I think it might have been a little bit overhyped for me because I know a lot of people really love this one, and while I did find it quite funny, I didn't fall in love with the characters. I found it really hard to connect emotionally with the story, and I think that's in part because of the slapstick comedy, because I feel like I was kind of giggling to myself at something silly that happens, and then a couple of pages later I'm supposed to feel emotionally invested in this deep meaningful moment, and I just didn't. And yeah, that was a little bit of a shame. It meant that I didn't really feel invested in our characters or their story. So I guess the heart of this story really is about a father who's trying to save their daughter who is stuck in this city that has been besieged by enemies. So they're trying to go ahead and rescue her. And yeah, I just didn't really feel that motivated by that plot line. And what I will say as well is that 90% of this book is travelling. So most of the time in this story we're following the band as they're getting back together, and then we're following them as they go on their journey to try and get to the city to save one of the band members' daughters. And along the way, of course, there's fights, there's creatures that they come up against, and they have antics, and very much like you would expect in a D&D game. But yeah, I just found myself just wanting to get to the city and to move on with the plot. So although the writing was very fast-paced in here, I personally felt like the story dragged. I think just because I didn't care that much about the group dynamic, and I just kind of wanted to get to the city and to kind of see the plot through. So yeah, I have mixed opinions about this one. All in all, I thought it was quite funny, it was quite refreshing and quite a nice light fantasy to break up some of the more heavier fantasies that I've read, but I didn't love it as much as I wanted to. So yeah, I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts on this one. Did you really love this? I definitely would recommend it to you if you are a fan of Dungeons and Dragons and rock music, because that is definitely like the unique selling point of this story. But yeah, mixed opinions about this one. I had fun with it, but I didn't love it. Okay, so next up we have a fantasy novella called Silver in the Woods, written by Emily Tesh, and I just adored this little story. It's the first book in a fantasy duology and it follows two main characters. So we have the first character, who is Tobias, who is this wild man who lives out in the forest, and he lives at one with nature, and he's very much like the Green Man from mythology, if you're aware of that character. And he lives a very peaceful life in the forest, forest. He lives in his cottage, which is hidden away from the rest of the world, and he spends time with his pet cat and with his dryad friends. And then one day he ends up meeting the second character, who is a man called Henry Silver. And Henry somehow stumbles across Tobias's cottage and he gets to know him, and we follow their relationship together. And then one day something happens to Henry Silver. He's placed in a lot of danger when he starts to uncover some secrets about the past, and he starts to understand the reason why Tobias is connected to this forest. And it's such a lovely story. It's quite slow, so if you're not a fan of slow sort of lyrical stories, then this one might not necessarily be for you, but I just loved it. I loved the gorgeous descriptions of the nature and of the forest, and it just made me want to run outside into the nature barefoot and feel my toes in the grass and just breathe in the fresh air, because it really makes you have an appreciation for nature in the way that it's written. And I also just fell in love with the characters, particularly with Henry Silver. He's such a sweet character, and I found myself surprisingly emotionally attached to the characters and to the world and to the forest, and I was surprisingly moved by some of the events that happened in this first story. So yeah, I absolutely love this one. I thought it was just such a lovely story, and would highly recommend it to you if you think it sounds interesting. Next up we have another novella, but this one is a science fiction novella, and it's called To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. So this is a lovely little story, and I feel like Becky Chambers is quickly becoming one of my favourite authors. I just love all of the books that I've picked up by her. This one is no exception, although I do think this one was a little bit harder for me to get into compared to some of her other stories, which I've immediately felt invested in. But this was still a really, really lovely and unique story. This book follows a crew of people who are researching different planets. So they're out on an exploration mission out in the universe, and it's broken up into sections. So I think there's 3 sections, and each section is this crew basically exploring a different planet, and the book is presented kind of like a report that's been written and is being beamed back to Earth. So yeah, it's a really interesting look at what is happening to these characters, what they're finding on each of these planets, and there's also a little bit more of a question that the crew are having to face by the end of the book, but I will keep that a secret because it's only short and it's quite nice to uncover that for yourself. But yeah, what I enjoyed about this was finding out a little bit about these different planets and experiencing these new worlds through our characters' eyes, but I also thought that it was really interesting exploring what it would be like if you were a researcher that was funded by the people of Earth, out and about in space, but that you're carrying out this research so far away from your home planet. So they are out in the universe, you know, light years away from Earth, and so any news that they hear from Earth is very delayed because it takes so long for that message to reach them. So they're finding out about history of Earth, they're finding out about political changes and things many years after they've happened, and it's really interesting seeing how our characters are affected by that and how it changes their points of view and the way that they see themselves, because they have this really disjointed connection to the people of Earth. And it's just really interesting kind of exploring those themes. And I also quite like some of the science elements in here. I like the fact that between each planet stop, the characters would go into cryogenic stasis, and so they would be put to sleep essentially because it's such a long distance between each planet that they are exploring. And during that time when they're asleep, their bodies are actually changed. So through technology, I guess, their body is adapted to meet the new demands of the planets that they're going to. So for example, if they're going to explore a planet that has very little light, then when they're in stasis, their skin will be adapted to give off more light so that they can be more easily seen in lower light situations. And I just thought that was so interesting, the fact that we're seeing these characters and their bodies change and adapted to these different planets, and it was just really interesting. And what I love about Becky Chambers is her way to write really relatable characters and characters that you can really understand and feel for. And while it is a science fiction novel. It's very much a novel about people and about how we cope with certain situations and about how we feel connected to others. And I feel like I'm rambling on a little bit now, but yeah, I really enjoyed this one. Probably not as much as some of the other Becky Chambers books that I've read, but I still thought that it was really, really lovely and would recommend if you're looking for a quick sci-fi novel. Okay, so next up I read Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. So this is the second book in the Farseer trilogy, which is the first trilogy in the Realm of the Elderlings series, which is a very expansive fantasy series that all takes place in the same world. So in this first series we follow our main character of Fitz, who is actually the bastard son of the King in Waiting. And the King in Waiting actually abdicated his right to the throne because of the shame around this siring of an illegitimate son. And in the first story we follow Fitz from a young child through to his teen years, and we see, well, we first meet him when he is dropped off at the palace, and no one really knows what to do with him because he undeniably has royal blood, but he's not a full royal, as it were, because he is a bastard son. And so yeah, there's a bit of a confusion about what to do with this child when he is delivered to the palace, and he ends up being raised by the stable man, at least in the public's eyes. He is raised as a stable boy, but he also has access to some of the political goings on within the keep and gets involved a little bit with the political machinations and the things that are going on behind the scenes, if that makes sense. And he actually ends up getting trained up to become a royal assassin, and he's in a really fortunate position as a bastard because he has access to the common folk, so the lower classes aren't going to bat an eyelid because they just see him as a stable boy, but he also gets access to some of the royal events and things as well because he is technically of royal blood, so he can kind of go about unseen and he can have access to all of these different places, which makes him a great candidate as an assassin. Anyway, in the first book, as I said, we follow him through till he's a teenager, and in the second book we're very much just following on from that, and we're seeing him going from a teenager through to an early adult, and we see as he is getting more and more involved in the politics of this world because it is very politics heavy, I would say. And what I love about this story is the characters, in particular the characters that Fitz comes to know throughout his life, and I really enjoyed in this second book seeing those character interactions and seeing his relationships grow and develop and deepen, and you really do start to become really invested in his relationships with others around him. But I also really love the magic system in here because it's so interesting. There are two different types of magic in this series. We have the wit and the skill. So the wit is actually a very frowned upon type of magic, and it involves being able to communicate and bond with animals. And then we have the skill, which is actually a really highly regarded type of magic, and it's used quite a lot by the noble classes, and it's a kind of mind magic. It's kind of like a mind control, mind manipulation type magic, which is so interesting, and I still don't know 100% how it works. We're still very much finding out a little bit about this type of magic through Fitz's eyes, and yeah, I just find it such an interesting magic system. But it's definitely one of those fantasy stories that doesn't spoon feed you. You kind of are just learning as you're going. And yeah, while I enjoyed the first book, I feel like after reading this second book I'm starting to get a lot more invested in the world and in the characters, and yeah, I'm starting to appreciate it a little bit more because this has been quite a slow series and it has taken me a little bit of a while to get into it. So yeah, I'm excited to see how this series rounds out with the third and final book, and yeah, let me know if you've read this one. I'd love to chat to you about it. Okay, so lastly, but by no means least, we have The Sword of Kaigin by M.L. Wang. So I buddy read this with V from the channel The Sassy Library Fox, and we had a lot of fun buddy reading this together because I feel like there was a lot that happened and a lot to discuss. So thank you so much, V, for reading this one with me. I actually finished this one in the first week of May, but I'm including it in this wrap up because I read the majority of it in April, and I just really loved this book. I thought it was so interesting. So this is a military fantasy story, and it's an adult book that is a standalone story, but it is linked to a middle grade series that this author has written, but you don't have to have read that one to appreciate this one. I personally haven't read the middle grade series, and I enjoyed this one as a standalone. And yeah, this is self-published and it follows two main perspectives, a mother called Misaki and her son called Mamoru. And the characters are both so interesting. Misaki, the mother figure, she is from this place called the Sword of Kaigin, but she had the opportunity as a child to visit other parts of the world. So she actually went to school in a different place and she learnt to sword fight, and she had a really interesting time kind of experiencing other cultures and meeting other people. But she ended up coming back to the Sword of Kaigin, where her family are from, to fulfill this arranged marriage. And the Sword of Kaigin is really interesting in its culture because it's quite traditional. Although this book is set in modern day times, the Sword of Kaigin has very kind of old-fashioned views. So in the Sword of Kaigin, the men are very much expected to become warriors and to train to be these amazing soldiers, and the women are very much encouraged to be housewives, and their kind of sole purpose really is to produce more warriors, so to get pregnant and to have babies and to raise them so that they can become warriors. And yeah, it's really interesting seeing Misaki's perspective because she had this experience outside of the Sword of Kaigin, but she's come back into this tradition, this place, and she's just such an interesting and complex character, and I really enjoyed how real she felt. She had quite a lot of flaws, she made decisions, she was quite inconsistent at times, and she just felt like just a really interesting and honest character to read about. And I also really enjoyed that we talked about what it's like to be a mother, and what I really enjoyed about this story is that Misaki was told her entire life that as soon as she becomes a mother, her life will feel complete and she'll have this instant love and adoration for her children, and she didn't actually experience that feeling in this book. And I feel like that's something that isn't talked about a whole lot in fantasy books, and so it's really interesting to see the perspective of a mother who didn't initially get that loving bond with her child, but we see how her relationship with her children changes over time. So yeah, I really loved her character. The second perspective is Mamoru, her son, who is brought up in this culture of the Sword of Kaigin, and so he has always believed that he is destined to be this really fierce great warrior, and he really idolizes that. And then we see what happens when war does actually arrive at his doorstep and he is forced to actually become a warrior himself and face the brutality of war. And he's also faced with the facts that perhaps the way that he's been raised and the culture that he has been brought up in isn't necessarily based on truth, and that's quite a harsh reality for him to face. So he was also a really fascinating character to read about. I will say that this book does have quite a lot of exposition, particularly in the beginning of the book. It is very info dumpy. It's quite a lot to try and get your head around. So some people might find the beginning part of this book a little bit slow to get through. I personally was invested in the story and the culture, and I really enjoyed finding out about the culture and how that affects the people who live in the Sword of Kaigin and how it affects their beliefs and their decisions. So I quite liked all the information that we got in the beginning of the book, but what I will say is that if you're struggling with that first little section of the story, do carry on with it because it gets pretty epic. Because when the action jumps in. When we get the action scenes, my goodness, they are spectacular. I am not an action type of girl. I tend to gloss over a little bit when I start to read action scenes, but within this book I was so invested and it was written so well that I just felt so compelled to read all of these scenes, and the magic and the way that it was described in the fight scenes was just so well done. It is very violent and it doesn't pull its punches. It really does show you the brutalities of war, so just be warned of that. But yeah, I just found it so gripping and I felt so invested in our characters. And another interesting thing that I thought was unique about this story is that the action actually happens in the middle of the book. So I do feel like some people might find that pacing feels a little bit weird because we're used to having action at the end of a fantasy story where things really escalate and you get this big explosion at the end of the book. Whereas in this one, we have quite a lot of information given to us in the beginning, lots of building up of the characters and the culture. We then get the action in the middle of the book, and there's also a significant amount of time dedicated towards the end of the book of the aftermath of war. So yeah, I feel like you might like that, you might not. I personally found that it was a really refreshing way to present a fantasy story, and I really liked that we had a lot of time dedicated to what happens after the action and how, you know, individuals and survivors have to build themselves back up, how they're affected by the things that happened, how the culture is affected by what's happened. And yeah, I feel like I'm rambling at this point, but I thought this was such an interesting book and I really, really enjoyed it. Yes, it was a little bit info heavy and you do have to suspend your disbelief a little bit at times because this is set in modern day, although a lot of the fight scenes involve sort of sword fighting and magic and stuff rather than guns. So you do have to suspend your disbelief a little bit. But if you enjoy a character-driven story and really raw and honest characters, then I would definitely recommend this one because honestly it had some of the best character arcs that I've read about. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed this one. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this video. I really hope that you've enjoyed it. Please let me know if you've read any of these books before, because I'd love to have a chat with you in the comments, or let me know what your favourite book was from last month. I'd love to have a little chat with you. And don't forget to like this video if you liked it, because it really does help out my channel, and do subscribe if you want to see more from me, because I'd love to have you here. And yeah, I guess I'll see you next time with another video. Bye!